What's going on, everybody, and welcome to a new Wheel of Time diary. I actually am blanking on what episode this would be. It's the first one for the Dragon Reborn book 3 of the series, and if I'm remembering, I did 5 for the first book and 4 for the second book, so this one should be episode 10. I don't know, the title and description will say different if that's not the case. But regardless, I'm very excited to be doing this video. In fact, I think I'm more excited for this diary than I have been for, most of the rest of them, besides when I started and finished like Eye of the World, just like kind of as a first experience type thing. I'm just generally really excited. I got a lot of reading done. I think this book has done a lot of good for me for actually starting to find a little bit more of a groove for my reading with my new work schedule and everything, because that was heavily affected by a change of work schedule and everything. I read for nearly 8.5 hours this week. Read this book pretty much solely for 8.5 hours, but I also spent some time reading something else as well the other night, so that was pretty neat. I haven't read this much in a full week period in probably a month and a half or more than that. It might be upwards of 2 months at this point, so I feel rather accomplished by that, and I'm going to have to keep up that pace for the next few weeks to be able to finish this book according to schedule, based off of some other things that I have planned for mostly next week. Next week's reading diary might be quite short, whereas this one I think might be a little bit lengthy because I got through quite a bit of material in terms of how I would rate my material, the material that I read this week. Easy 5 stars. I've said this for nearly every week that I've been doing Wheel of Time diaries, but yeah, 5 stars. This is... I've only read, let's see, out of the hardcover, I've read about 100 and, if you include the pages of the prologue, because they're not counted as normal pages, they're counted as introductory pages in this book, I've read, oh good grief, how does math work? About 185 or so pages out of this book so far. A decent chunk of the way through, and I think it's been my favorite book of the 3 so far, even more than The Great Hunt, and has had equal amounts of like the magic that I felt reading Eye of the World. It's kind of a weird thing, but we can discuss that another time, how I feel about Eye of the World versus The Great Hunt. But Dragon Reborn has been, like I said, my favorite of the 3 books so far, and I've had a really great time with it in terms of the spoiler-free. It's essentially spoiler-free. I'm surprised to find that I was largely right, at least up to this point in the book. I was largely right about my theory at the end of the last reading diary and at the end of the last book. Of course, reading diaries will go into spoilers, and even when I'm talking about spoiler-free, there's a chance that I will talk about spoilers from previous books, so just be forewarned. If I mention something from The Great Hunt or Eye of the World and you haven't been reading the series along with me, or you haven't already read them before and you're still watching this, I don't know what you're doing. Either way, this book, for the first 100 pages or so, beyond just the prologue, was largely Perrin's POV. And then for everything since then has been Egwene's POV. In fact, the place that I stopped, right at chapter 19, is the first chapter of Matt's POV in the book. Everything before that was just like the prologue, Perrin's POV for like 90 pages, and then Egwene's POV for 80 pages or so. So it'll be really easy to kind of go through the material that I read this week in the spoiler filled, because, I can just go POV by POV and go by the storylines that I've read so far. But yeah, the material of it has just been so incredibly good, but I was largely correct about Rand potentially being missing from this book and seeing sort of his madness or experiencing some other storylines take forefront after we've already had him as a POV for like the vast majority of the previous 2 books. It's a little surprising to have the book be named after him and this be the case, but I was theorizing that that would be the case, so to find that that's actually been true, at least up to this point, has been kind of fun. There was 1 page of Rand POV. 1 page. 1 page at the end of a Perrin chapter. In fact, it might have been right before the Egwene section, actually, if I'm remembering correctly. I don't remember for sure. I'll probably see it when I get into my notes. But yeah, like I said, about 8.5 hours read. I got through chapter 18. So yeah, I got quite a bit done. Without further ado, I think I've talked long enough prior to, actually getting into the spoiler field. So let's actually talk about the spoiler field. First off, I want to talk about that prologue, which I thought was really, really incredible. It really set me off on the right foot. basically finishing off in some sense, or at least continuing from one of the POVs from book 2, that being of whatever his name, Bornhold, the White Cloak person who died at the end of that book with his White Cloak army in the climax, essentially, of the Great Hunt. This book, the prologue, takes place from sort of the Commander Neil. I hope it's pronounced Neil, not like Niall or something different like that. Someone correct me if I'm wrong, but Commander Neil of the White Cloaks. White Cloaks, is that what they're called? For some reason, I'm just having a stroke and forgetting that if that's what they're called or not. In another area of the world is, having some sort of conversation with several other characters, several other White Cloak characters, a couple of them directly associated with events that were happening in the Great Hunt. One of them was the child of Bornhold, and then the other one was Childbuyer, who was there, and then a couple other people who were kind of associated with those events. So I thought the prologue was really good. It was the longest of the 3 prologues so far. I think it was like 16 pages, so it wasn't short, but it flew by. It was really high quality. I really enjoyed what I read out of there. And really kind of set the tone, I think, perfectly for what was going down. But moving into chapter 1 is where the Perrin POV starts, and Perrin POV goes through the first 90 pages, which is how many chapters of this is Perrin? I think it's 9 chapters. Yes, and I was right. Yes, the 1 page of Rand POV is at the end of chapter 9, which is the last Perrin chapter of the first initial sequence of his POV. But yes, the first 9 chapters were all Perrin POV, and I surprisingly really enjoyed this. Like, Perrin was already a character that I felt like was being slept on a little bit from the first 2 books. For whatever reason, Matt always felt like he was more important than Perrin within the trio. Even though Perrin was the one that has had some POVs in the past, and I don't think Matt has had a POV in the series yet until chapter 19 of this book, which I haven't read yet. And if there was a Matt POV at some earlier point, I don't remember, but I just know that Perrin has had POVs for sure. So I'm surprised that he's been slept on up to this point, but I was very happy to get some actual POVs for his character now, and I really liked the events that were coming down. And also kind of the more, back end type stuff, because plenty of this POV early on is just Perrin and Rand and, all of everybody who's essentially committed themselves to Rand as the Dragon Reborn are kind of hidden away in a mountain pass at the moment during the winter. And a lot of what goes on in these first few chapters has to do with Perrin and his association with Rand and his talking with Rand and witnessing, most importantly, just as I assumed this book would do some of, witnessing Rand as he's starting to really kind of descend into madness from, touching, Sidin, from the male half of the true source of the One Power, which is kind of a mouthful, but that's kind of how things are. I think that this material is incredible. I'm loving being able to see Rand from other people's eyes. I love being able to see Rand from other people's eyes in The Great Hunt, because there were several moments where we got little brief glimpses of that. But this book is a little bit more forefront, where it's like Perrin is seeing Matt through his own eyes and is seeing Rand through his own eyes and is experiencing that relationship in a completely different way than was ever like really truly brought to the forefront in the previous books, and I love that. But also within these early chapters of the book, I also got to really kind of identify one of the things that I think I've really enjoyed so far about the series so far in all 3 books. And the way that Jordan has handled his inciting incidents is incredible to me, because in Eye of the World, the inciting incident is essentially, there are Trollocs and a Fade in the 2 rivers now for some reason. Everybody needs to leave, or at least the 3 Tavern, if that's how it's pronounced, where Rand, Matt, and Perrin basically need to leave the 2 rivers in order to keep it safe, because if they don't leave, the Trollocs and everybody are going to invade again, trying to kill them. That was the inciting incident in the first book, and I love the way that was handled in that book. At The Great Hunt, the inciting incident was essentially, Padan Fain was, basically released from his prison, and the horn was also stolen. We need to go get the horn back and maybe hopefully get Padan Fain along the way. That was the inciting incident of the second book, for all intents and purposes, and now the inciting incident of the third book, which happens, in chapters 4 and 5? Yeah, pretty much 4 and 5, where Trollocs and Fades again invade this sort of encampment that everybody who is following the Dragon Reborn have gathered into. And I really liked this material because it was another one of those moments like, okay, well, we are getting introduced to like this story where it's at the moment, but what pushes the plot forward? What is the plot going to be moving towards? And this moment does it. Just the inciting incidents of the series so far has just been very good to me and very effective. I really enjoyed the battle sequence and being able to get also a closer look, not just Perrin being able to observe Rand and his relationship with Rand, but also his relationship with himself is a little bit deeper too. Just the way that Perrin is very conflicted about his wolf brother senses, you know, contacting wolves and some of his innate abilities and senses that kind of come with being wolves and craving meat and some of these things. It was briefly touched on in the second book, including a little bit of anxiety about, you know, like his eyes and everything, but not quite to the extent that so far in the Dragon Reborn that has been a very, very heavy topic for Perrin. He's thought about that constantly, and I find that to be a very interesting, you know, sort of character-based arc that is going on. I can't wait to get to see Perrin basically reconcile with that side of himself. Whether that be throwing it away or not, but giving himself over to the wolf sense for this battle really kind of accentuated that, because it actually showed us, the readers, why Perrin doesn't like to be there, including, you know, some of the other aftermath as well. Just very good. But shortly after this inciting incident, Rand leaves, and it is presumed that he is leaving because he's going to Tear, so that, you know, he can either prove that he's not actually the Dragon Reborn by just dying, or where he will prove that he is actually the Dragon Reborn, and therefore nobody can, you know, claim he's a false dragon. That's basically the presumption that's being made here, and it's a great way to be able to push this storyline forward. Just be like, okay, I guess that's what these people are doing now. Rand is headed that direction. We've got to chase Rand now. That's what's going on, and I'm keen to see where that goes, because that's more or less how the storyline ends. Is these people, you know, this group of people essentially leave their place in the mountain, but then they're just starting to travel in the direction that they think they find Rand, and they're actually not that far behind Rand at the end of where Perrin's POV ends within this first part of the book. But I'm also going to, you know, mention something that I think I mentioned a couple times within the Great Hunt's Wheel of Time Diaries as well. I'm surprised so far by how good the character interactions are, especially where they're involved with character-related problems. Perrin's interactions with Moraine, especially throughout some of these later chapters of his POV here, you know, chapters 8 and 9 essentially, are very, very good. Perrin's interactions with Rand were also quite enjoyable. There's just a lot of kind of little stuff going on here that's like, that feels real and that feels natural, and I really enjoy the way that that's going. But overall, I think I ought to move now into the next section of this discussion, where I talk about, you know, the rest of what I read, which was all from Egwene's POV. So having to deal with the girls in Tar Valon, and who are also, you know, transporting Mat to Tar Valon to be healed, because he's not yet been disconnected from the dagger at this point. Quite the material as well. I'm also surprised that I'm really enjoying Egwene's POV. I'm surprised to be really enjoying this storyline as much as well. I know that Jordan gets a lot of flack for how he writes his female characters and what he does with them and how they behave and how it doesn't necessarily feel real, but up to this point in the series, I haven't had any issue with it, and I've actively enjoyed Egwene's POV for basically all of the time that it has existed, especially within this book. I think the storyline in Tar Valon so far has been very enjoyable. What with Egwene and the other girls returning to Tar Valon after, you know, several months away, after being whisked away from Tar Valon by what was her name? Liandrin of the Black Aja within the Aes Sedai, and them returning, and kind of the reaction that their return to Tar Valon is starting to have, and also plots that are starting to form with these girls, as well as a handful of the Aes Sedai, including the Amyrlin Seat, who I think is also becoming a favorite character of mine as well. I just really like... There was one short chapter in here that was from her POV, and it's one of my favorite chapters of the book so far. It just really worked for me. Her internal monologuing, the way that she weighed her decisions and thought about them, I thought that all of that was great. But most of what I read within this section was kind of setting forth a new plotline of Egwene and Nynaeve, and subsequently Elaine, because they told her, being set on a task to basically watch out for other potential Black Aja within the White Tower, because the Amyrlin Seat, who is essentially, allied with Moraine and with Viren of the Brown Aja, they're kind of doing things in ways and with prophecy that maybe some of the other Aes Sedai wouldn't really like, or would, get rid of them for, or would still them for, even depending on the circumstance. The way that these three don't feel like they can fully trust anybody else, because they're also some of the few people to actively know that Rand is the Dragon Reborn, to have speculated as such, and furthermore to, know that Rand has proclaimed as much as well. These three can't really trust anybody else within the White Tower. They just can't, because any of them could be Black Aja, and many of the rest of them would simply be upset at them for what they're doing in the first place anyway, even if they aren't Black Aja. So they kind of have to watch out for stuff. But Egwene and Nynaeve and Elaine have been set out on this task essentially to watch for potential Black Aja within the tower. That's kind of what they're doing, alongside, being punished to make it seem like nothing is suspect, which I think is great. But the start of this plotline is turning out very interesting, especially since pretty much immediately Egwene nearly gets killed by a crossbow bolt. But what I found so interesting about the storyline so far is essentially how it's done a great job, having like this sort of like quasi sub mystery to it. You're seeing through Egwene's eyes for basically everything up to this point, and it's been like, okay, well, these people are seeming kind of suspicious for these reasons, or your implied suspicion because of things that people say and because of knowing what they're supposed to be doing. For example, chapter 17, the Red Sister, is when Elida comes and, chastises Elaine, but also talks to the other girls, trying to ask them questions of where they were and what they were doing for the past few months. The way it's kind of framed, and I think it's intentionally framed this way by Egwene as, the sort of the point of view, to make Elida seem even more suspicious than her character kind of already was from the very beginning in Eye of the World, when Rand was with Elaine and Elida and whatever the queen's name and whatever the queen's name that Elaine's mother is. I forget her name for some reason off the top of my head. I just like the way that things are being framed, but then it moves very quickly after that into, okay, now we're actually healing Matt, and Matt's been disconnected from his dagger now in chapter 18 and has been supposedly healed. But the chapter does end with Egwene and everybody being taken away from Matt, who still hasn't woken up, but the next chapter is Matt waking up, so I'm very keen to see what happens next. I've really enjoyed both of these storylines so far. I find it a little bit weird that the first 90 pages of the book was Perrin, and then there's been, so far, 80 pages, basically, of Egwene, with one chapter of the Amyrlin Seat in there, and then moving for the next, I think it's like another 130 pages or something like that, 140, maybe even 150 pages, just briefly skimming through to see if I see, any chapters with like Perrin within the first paragraph, because if you have a character's name like that within the first paragraph, they're basically the POV. Pretty easy to tell at this point, but I briefly skimmed through and was like, when does Perrin come back? Because I also want more of Perrin's storyline, and it doesn't seem like he comes back until like 150 pages from now. Good thing I'm enjoying this storyline, because it would be kind of long if the storyline was going on for that long and I wasn't interested in it. But yeah, there's been a lot of great material so far. I'm heavily enjoying myself. I hope that any of my thoughts and ramblings in this video so far have been enjoyable to watch in some sense, but I have been really enjoying the book, and if it continues on at the type of quality that this has been, I think it will be easily my favorite of the 3 books in the Wheel of Time so far. And all I hear is good things about The Shadow Rising, and just at this point, it's too early to really be able to say for sure, especially when, if I can point correctly, these books exist. If the Wheel of Time is for me, but based off of what I'm enjoying and how much I'm enjoying from these first 3 books, I genuinely do think that this series is just for me, and I'm really happy that I did pick it up finally. So thank you guys for watching this diary. If you happen to watch all the way through, thank you for dealing with my ramblings. I have fun making these videos, even though I frequently have to break because I'm kind of confused and have to try to remember stuff and have to reference my notes to actually know what's going on. And with so many different things going on, sometimes it's hard to remember for sure what's happened, and I forget little details or I misspeak sometimes. But thank you guys for watching anyway. If you did, I'll be back next week, of course, with part 2 of the diaries. You know, however far I get into the book by that point. I don't think I'll be able to read that much this week because I have another important reading obligation to do over the course of the week. I'll still try to get, at least a little bit of this done, maybe 100 pages, maybe less, depending on what I'm able to do. Definitely not as much as I got read over the past week, but heck, it could be as little as like 50 pages. Who knows? I hope it won't be that little, but we'll see what happens. I am definitely excited to get to more of it, and it makes me very, very, very excited to get to the Shadow Rising in November and December as well, because I'm most likely going to be able to do that at that point. At least that's tentatively what I have planned, assuming nothing else horrible changes. So thank you guys one final time for watching. I'll be back in the next video and again for the next diary of this book next week.